today we're picking up with Biology 102, Unit 10, which is Population Ecology. So population ecology is going to be the study of how populations interact with their environment. So with this, we have ecology. We said was studying the interactions organisms and their environments have with each other, and it can be studied at many different levels. You have individuals that you can study, so you could study at the individual level. This is going to be studying individual organisms and how they respond biochemically, physiologically, behaviorally to its environment. You can have a population, and that's going to be the study of groups of individuals of organisms that interbreed with each other. It's going to be concerned with how populations change over time. And so this will include things like growth rates, distribution, and genetic composition. Next, we have communities. So that's going to be the study of populations of different species that interact with each other within a locale. And then you have ecosystems. That's a study of all living things and non-living elements that are interacting in a particular area. So with population ecology, it's going to be that study of interaction between populations of organisms and their environment, particularly their patterns of growth and how they're going to be influenced by other species and by environmental factors in that area that they live in. So a population perspective is going to be necessary in ecology. So basically, let's talk about population first. It's simply going to be a group of organisms of the same species that live in a particular geographic region. And so we have a critical shift in the perspective that's going to be required for studying populations. That is, it's going to be a shift from viewing the individual as a primary focus of our attention to the population. And so most ecological processes cannot be observed or studied within an individual. Rather, you're going to have to study them, and they're going to emerge considering the entire group of individuals and how they exchange genes and how they interact with each other within that particular place that they're coming from. So here we have population ecology. We're going to examine the features that cannot be studied on the individual level. Instead, we need to look at the entire group that work together. Populations can grow quickly for a while, but they do not grow forever. And so there's no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that, if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. And that was stated by Charles Darwin in his On the Origin of Species book that he had written. And so there are going to be some things that go into populations. And 6 reasons, basically, that we're going to study population ecology. First, one of the important things is that there need to be stable populations. So how many of 5 million eggs that a female cod might lay over a course of her life will, on average, survive and grow to adulthood? Who leaves more surviving offspring? A pair of elephants or a pair of rabbits? Those are all good questions to ask. And so there's going to be 6 reasons why we study ecology at a population level. These are some important things that we need to know. One of those things is going to be the ecological process that can't be observed or studied within an individual. Like we said, it's better observed as that entire group. We need to also look at those genetic changes, like we said. We need to see if things are changing over time or if the genes of the entire population are changing or just one. We look at birth rates. That's going to be the ratio of live births in a population in a particular area. We'll also look at death rates. That's going to be a rate at which individuals of a certain age will die. We look at immigration rates. That's going to be a rate at which individuals move into a population, and even immigration rates. And immigration rates are going to be the rate at which individuals leave or move out of that population. So exponential growth, like we said, occurs when each individual produces more than a single offspring necessary to replace itself. So according to realistic and moderate estimates of birth and death rates, a population of just 500 elk would grow to more than 1 billion individuals within 80 years and eventually would cover the earth. So figuring out how a population grows or how it shrinks, we're going to have two pieces of information that's going to be needed for this. You have what's called a per capita growth rate. And so that growth rate is going to be abbreviated as in lowercase r. If the number is positive, or basically what you're going to do is determine the birth rate minus the death rates there. So if the number is positive, that population is going to be growing. If the number is negative, the population is going to be getting smaller. And so how do we determine these birth rates? Well, individuals in a population we're going to look at in just a minute are going to help us determine that. So the number of individuals in that population we're going to use as the capital N. So we're going to multiply it lowercase r times n. So growth rate times the number of individuals in the population. So here we have individuals in that population being 500. Over the course, let's say, of 125 years, offspring are going to be born. The birth rate is 125 over 500, or 0.25 births per person. If 25 out of the 500 individuals die during the course of the same year, then the death rate will be 25 divided by 500, or 0.05 deaths per person. So the growth rate is going to be 0.25 minus 0.05, or 0.20 for individual persons. So that will be its growth rate. And so here is simply looking at this exponential growth chart, and it shows over time how the individuals will reproduce and create more in that population than one that replaces itself. So populations tend to grow exponentially until limited resources will cause their growth to slow to logistic rates. Let's go back for a minute to exponential growth right here. So with exponential growth, basically that's going to be defined as a population growth at a rate proportional to its current size. So the bigger a population, the faster it's going to grow. This occurs when individuals produce, like we said, more than a single offspring necessary to replace itself. So population size growing exponentially becomes quite large using the same calculations above. For example, if you had 500 individuals in 10 years, it would grow to 2,580. 4 million in 50 years, and 8 billion in 80 years. So population's growth is going to be limited by its environment. And so two main factors will limit that. First, we have density-dependent factors, things that's going to be limitations on a population's growth as a consequence of the population's density. So population density is going to be the number of individuals in a population in that given area. So we have 4 different types of limitations there. You have food supply, so it reduces the food that's going to be available. You have a habitat for living and breeding, and so with that, it could diminish the accessibility to places to live and breed. You could have parasitic and disease risks that will increase the spread more easily when a host lives at a higher dense capacity. So the closer animals are to each other, when they become ill, they tend to spread that illness. And predation risks, that's going to be an increase as predator populations grow in response to the increased availability of prey. And also, the more densely packed prey become, they become more visible. So density-dependent factors, these are going to be limitations on a population's growth that are going to be consequences of population density. So with that population density, like we said, that's the number of individuals within a given area. The ceiling on growth is going to be called the carrying capacity. Now, carrying capacity is going to be abbreviated with a K. And so when we see that in an equation, that's what you know it stands for, the carrying capacity of that environment. So as the population size approaches the carrying capacity of the environment, death rate will increase. Migration rates are also going to increase. Individuals seek more hospitable places to live. Birth rates will start to decrease. And so there you have, for example, a low food supply is going to give rise to poor nutrition, which will reduce fertility. So how does the carrying capacity of an environment influence its population growth? Well, if the population size is shown by the N, it's going to be small to its relative carrying capacity, which is K. There's going to be plenty of resources and population growth is going to increase exponentially. But if the population size, which we see there with the N again, is going to be close to the value of its carrying capacity, which is the K, then environment is going to be nearly full to capacity and population growth is going to slow. So what you would do is you take the R times the N, multiply by K minus N over K, and it's going to vary between 0 and 1. So if the new term with this equation is going to be close to 1, population growth is essentially unchanged. So looking here, we see exponential growth, we see the carrying capacity, and we see logistic growth. And so with logistic growth, that's going to be a pattern of population growth in which the exponential growth levels off and carrying capacity is going to be approached. It's going to produce kind of like an S-shaped growth curve that you see there. And it's going to be much better approximation of how populations grow in the real world. Sometimes you'll see, quite often, you'll see population oscillations, and that's basically population cycles between periods of rapid growth and rapid shrinkage. So it'll go up and then it'll go down. So density-independent forces, like we said, factors that strike populations without regard to size of that population. These are mostly going to be weather-based, so it's things like floods, earthquakes, fires, lightning, and habitat destruction. So these are things that can affect the population size, but it's going to be basically done by external factors. And so density-independent forces, like these natural disasters, you can see in this graph how once the density of that population goes up, how it will sharply decrease or decline after that natural disaster hits. And then it'll start to go up again. Then it'll come into another natural disaster and it'll shrink back down. And so in an environment in which a bad luck event repeatedly occurs, that population can be in a perpetual state of exponential growth with periodic massive mortality events. So this would be an example of an oscillation in that population. So how many people can Earth support? And why does that answer keep increasing? At first, we thought it was about 7 billion. Well, we're over that 7 billion now, and so we keep increasing that number. Why does it keep increasing? Well, we have the development of agricultural technologies as an example of how we can increase the carrying capacity on the Earth. As we learn newer, better ways to increase our food production and to create a food production at a much faster rate and produce more, we are able to increase the number of people on Earth. So consider that in 1883, an acre of farmland produced on average about 11.5 bushels of corn. By 1933, that was up to 19.5 bushels an acre. And then by 1992, it had increased to 95 bushels per acre. So within about 100 years, we had increased that dramatically. So how did this happen? Well, the development, like we said, of several agricultural technologies. We include the size of vigorous hybrid varieties of corn. Remember, we selectively bred, so we could have different variants of corn that survived in better conditions, that were able to withstand things like drought, withstand pesticides, and then we even were able to genetically modify those things later on. That's going to help make it more possible to produce more and more food at the same amount of time and with the same amount of land. So that's just going to be one example of how the carrying capacity of an environment can be increased. And of course, at the same time, this carrying capacity has likely been decreased for many other species trying to live in the same environment as humans and their crops, unfortunately. So a population's growth can be reduced by both density-dependent factors related to crowding and then density-independent factors. Those, remember, are things such as natural disasters. So some populations cycle between large and small. So we talked about those population oscillations. There we see how it goes up and down, and usually it has to do with food supply, it has to do with weather, and it also has to do with predator-prey relationships. So snowshoe hares are going to be the prey, and the lynx is going to be the predator. So as the hares go up, the lynx will be able to go up because it has a better food supply. As they start to kill out the hares, then the lynx will run out of food or not have as much food. They'll have to compete more, and so their population will decline along with the hare. Right, so thanks to the Hudson Bay Company, which kept detailed records on the number of pelts it purchased from fur trappers, this population cycling is going to be very well documented. Although its cause is not fully certain, to some extent, this predator and prey cause their own cycling. So, number one, we have the rabbit population size growing, providing more food for the lynx, which then reproduce at a higher rate, causing them to eat too many of the rabbits, thereby reducing their food source, causing the lynx population to then crash, and enables the rabbit population to then grow, and the cycle begins anew again, over and over. So, do lemmings jump off cliffs committing suicide when their populations get too big? The answer is no. This is going to be an urban myth. The lemming population, they do occasionally experience large increases in size, and just like the locust behavior that we saw that changes when population density gets too great, their behavior changes a bit too, and these individuals start to kind of migrate away from an area that they were in to a less crowded habitat. And lots of times these are areas that they don't know about, they don't understand what unfamiliar territories there. So sometimes they do fall off of cliffs, but they don't commit suicide. They don't jump off these cliffs voluntarily. It's just an accident. So that is a urban myth, urban legend. So now we're going into what's known as a maximum sustainable yield. So the maximum sustainable yield is going to be a useful but impossible to implement concept. It's going to be a point at which the maximum number of individuals are removed from a population. And so there's going to be three keys here. It does not impair growth rates. It is calculated at a point in which population is growing at its fastest rate. And it's going to occur half the carrying capacity. At half carrying capacity there. So some useful concepts. It's useful and applicable in nearly most natural resources, things like wood harvesting, livestock, and agriculture even. So here we see effective and sustainable management of those natural resources requires the determination of the maximum sustainable yield there. So they need to figure out what's going to be the best number of trees for that area. And so virtual all natural resource managers in the U.S. government are going to fail to do their job as mandated. Why is that? Well, because maximum sustainable yield like we said, is a useful concept, but it's going to be difficult to put into practice because it's hard to accurately determine the population size, and it's hard to determine the carrying capacity in nature. What we think might be a carrying capacity might be completely off. So, what often we don't know, like we said, was carrying capacity of natural resources, number of individuals that are actually going to be alive, the stability of carrying capacity from year to year, and which individuals to harvest and which ones to leave behind in order to reproduce. So when fighting a cockroach infestation, is it more effective to try to kill the females as opposed to the males? What would be the use of that? Well, since the females are going to be the ones that are producing the eggs and are the ones that are actually creating the new individuals, then it would make more sense to try to figure out some way to specifically attack the female cockroaches. That way it halts all reproduction. So the concept of maximum sustainability yield is going to generate insights in fighting biological pests such as these cockroaches here. So based on models of population growth, it seems easy to efficiently and sustainably utilize natural resources. In practice, however, the difficulties such as estimating population size and carrying capacity are going to make its implementation kind of difficult and hard to do. A life history is like an executive summary of species. So it's going to be defined as a vital statistics of a species, and it has 4 different species statistics. Age at first reproduction is going to be important. Probabilities of survival and reproduction at each age, litter size and frequency, and longevity. So life histories are going to be shaped by basically natural selection. And there's going to be 3 variations. So do any animals mate themselves to death? If so, why? Well, the first variation that we're going to talk about is going to be Big Bang reproduction. And so Big Bang reproduction is species reaching a sexual maturity at 1 year of age. Those species will mate intensely over 3-week periods. The males die shortly after mating, and then the females die shortly after weaning their first litter. Next, you're going to have what's called the fast intensive reproduction. Here, it's going to reach sexual maturity in 1 month, and then the species produce litters of 6 to 10 offspring every month after that. And then you have what's called slow gradual reproduction. And so with this one, the species are going to reach sexual maturity at 1 year of age, and these species are going to produce about 1 offspring per year. So it's going to be a slow and gradual process. So why all the variation? Is one strategy going to be better than others evolutionarily? Well, there's going to be many possible responses to the challenge here. When to reproduce, how often should a species reproduce, and how much should they reproduce? So these vital statistics of these species are going to include things like age at first reproduction, like we said, probabilities of survival after they reproduce, and the size of their litter, and frequency and longevity. Reproductive investment is going to be the material and energetic contributions that an individual will make to its offspring. So basically, what's going to be that cost of reproductive investment during any reproductive episode? And so with that, that's going to be energy. That's going to be how much they have to put into it, how much it takes to grow, feed, and care for that offspring. Producing offspring can be very risky, actually. So those costs of producing gametes, risk of dying during reproduction, or the wear and tear of the body during reproduction. So you're going to have a greater reproductive investment, which is going to equal greater individual risk of dying. So here, the natural selection is going to favor smaller numbers of offspring and enables additional offspring to maximize lifetime reproductive success. So why do humans put off mating so much longer than cats or even mice? So humans are going to be at the slow extreme of those life histories. We're going to reproduce, usually creating one offspring at a time. Sometimes we have multiples, and sometimes there's more than even two, but that's going to be very, very rare. And so usually we do not start to reproduce right away. It definitely not within the first year. Usually it is no earlier than the late teens, early 20s, and then that's when we start to generally have reproduction of our offspring. So an organism's investment pattern in growth and reproduction and survival is going to be its life history. Another question to think of is what's going to be the individual's likelihood of surviving to have future reproductive episodes? That's going to be another thing that they really need to think about with reproduction. So if there's going to be predator rates as a high rate of mortality there, if you have a lot of predators for a species, then the individual might be unlikely to be alive in 1 month in order to reproduce. So populations can be described quantitatively in life tables and survivorship curves. So with the life table, it's going to allow biologists to predict an individual's likelihood of either dying within a particular age interval or surviving that interval. So basically that table is going to present data on mortality rates within defined age ranges of a population, and it's going to be used to determine the individual's probability of dying during any particular year. Now with the survivorship curves, we're going to have graphs of the proportion of individuals of a particular age that are alive in a population. And so those are going to be created using basically life tables. And so graphs are going to show the proportion of an individual, like we said, of a particular age alive in a population with two main factors. So it's going to indicate the individual's likelihood of surviving through a particular age interval, and it's going to reveal a huge amount of information about a population. For example, whether most offspring produced die shortly after birth, or whether most offspring survive and are going to be likely to live long lives. And so with these survivorship curves, you can see that there's going to be three different types. You have type 1, which is a high survivorship until old age, then rapidly decreasing survivorship. You have a type 2. These are going to be survivorship decreases at a steady, regular pace. And then you have type 3. That's going to have a high mortality early in life, but those that survive early years are going to have long lives. Now with that one, most species do not have a survivorship curve that's going to be definitively a type 1, 2, or 3. It may be anywhere in between. It represents extremes, and it's going to help us predict reproductive rates and parental investment without extensive observation of the individual's behavior. And so these can also change over time. So there's going to be trade-offs between reproduction and longevity. So designing an organism to structure its life history for maximum fitness, it can create one that would produce many offspring, beginning just after birth, continuing every year, and while growing tremendously large, it will reduce the predation risk and live forever. So evolutionary constraints, these are going to be traits that are not all possible because selection that changes one feature tends to adversely affect others. And so we refer to these as evolutionary trade-offs. And so with this occurs when one life history characteristic increases, like we said, the other decreases, and it's going to have three main areas where it's going to allocate its resources. That's going to be growth, reproduction, and survival. So increased allocation to one of these areas tends to reduce allocation to one or both of the other areas. So looking at these. So organisms can allocate, like we said, their resources to growth. They can allocate them to reproduction or to just simply surviving. So reproduction and growth, we can have let's say a species of trees reproducing more seeds. It's going to grow slower than when no seeds are going to be reproduced or produced. The species of deer that did not reproduce in the first year of life might grow larger during that year. Reproduction or number of size of that offspring, so species, let's say of lizards, can produce medium-sized eggs. They compromise between many small eggs that usually equal poor survival and even a few larger eggs, which sometimes entitled to better survival. It helps maximize the number of offspring that's going to be reproduced. So if we're going to talk about eggs there, and then reproduction, let's say in survival, some species make a single exceptionally high investment in reproduction, and then sometimes they die shortly after. See here, we have reproduction and survival with that big bang reproducing, such as a salmon even, making an exceptionally high investment in its reproduction, then it dies shortly after. Beech trees grow much more slowly in the years when they produce many seeds than in the years when they don't. And then we talked about the number and size of offspring. So the female lizards of a species, they can produce medium-sized eggs and compromise between a large number of small eggs, where it might have more eggs there, but it might have poor survival rate for the offspring, or it could have a fewer large-sized eggs, which have a better survival of the offspring, but you get less of those. So because constraints limit evolution, life histories are going to be characterized by trade-offs between investments in growth, reproduction, and survival. Ecological influences the evolution of aging in a population. So unfortunately, as we get older, things start to fall apart. So what is aging and why does it occur? What exactly does aging mean? Well, this is going to be difficulty when we realize that no two people age exactly the same way, yet without fail, everyone is going to age. So we must retreat to a somewhat vague definition. For an individual, aging is the gradual breakdown of the body's machinery. It's basically an increased risk of mortality with increasing age. It's going to be characterized by multiple physiological breakdowns. Evolutionary explanation, force of natural selection is going to lessen with advanced aging. And of course, you're going to have two examples of this. So why do they age? Well, like we said, force of natural selection and many genetic diseases. They'll kill older people, but almost none kill younger people. So why is this? Well, like we said, there's two examples. And the first one, imagine a mutation that causes a person carrying it to die at the age of 10. Will the person carrying that mutation pass it on to many offspring? Of course not. The carrier of that mutant gene will die before she gets a chance to pass it on to anyone. Alternative versions of that gene that don't cause death will be passed on to only those that are able to persist. So basically, the alleles causing the sickness and death early in life is kind of a way of natural selection, weeding out alleles that cause sickness and death. So they won't be passed on because that person could never reproduce. Secondly, now imagine a mutation that causes a person carrying it to die at the age of 150. Will the person carrying that mutation pass it to many offspring? Yes, they could. The carrier of that mutant gene will already have had children passing on that mutant gene to them long before she even knows that she carries that killer gene. In fact, she will no doubt die long before that mutation even has the opportunity to exert its disastrous effect. And so the same thing happens if the mutation it's negatively affecting the age 100, 70, or even 50 years of age. So basically what we're saying is mutant genes are going to be responsible for aging. They have negative health effects that arise later in life. Reason that they're going to cause a lot of death out there. And so they're also going to be why your bodily systems start to fall apart as you get older. So a lot of these mutations are going to increase your risk for things like cancers or even heart disease and other types of ailments. They do not affect reproductive output, and consequently these mutations are going to be never cleaned out of the population because they don't usually start to show themselves until after reproduction of offspring has occurred. So you've already passed them on to offspring. So a cure for cancer may be discovered, but not a cure for aging. So what's the difference? Well, basically, you are going to continue to get older. There's nothing to stop it. We have come a long way in science and medicine. We have figured out ways to kind of slow that aging process. We've actually slowed the aging process and doubled the normal lifespan. It's been done experimentally. We've even seen that with fruit flies. Remember when we took them from a 20-hour lifespan and allowed them or bred them to live up to 160 or 180 hours? So one thing to think about, could it possibly be accomplished by increasing the strength of natural selection later on in life? Could we help increase the mean maximum longevity of individuals in a population? Well, I'm sure they're working on that now. They've done a lot of stem cell research that they're going into, trying to see how to expand life and how to help those live a longer life without their body breaking down over time. So basically keeping people, keeping their bodies younger and working properly for a longer period of time. Natural selection cannot weed out bad alleles that do not diminish an individual's relative reproductive success, but consequently they can accumulate in genomes of nearly all species, and that's going to lead to multiple physiological breakdowns that we see as we age. So what determines the longevity of different species? Well, we have environmental risks of aging. We have what's referred to as high hazard factors and low hazard factors. So hazard factors are going to be external forces on a population that increase risk of death. And so here we see first the high hazard factors. They're relatively high risk of death at an early age. So they reproduce earlier, their aging kicks in earlier, and then they have a shorter lifespan because of this. So they age a lot quicker. Low hazard factors are going to be relatively at a low risk of death at each age. The individual will reproduce later on in its life. It ages slower and has a longer lifespan. So high-risk worlds, death from external sources and reproduce early. Low-risk worlds, death from external sources are going to be low. So age at the time of reproduction. This is going to be a key factor in determining longevity. Early reproduction will also favor early aging. So those organisms or species that tend to reproduce very early on will not tend to have a long lifespan or will tend to die at an early age. So that in turn shows that later reproduction will also favor a later aging. But what determines when an organism reproduces? That, like we said, was the hazard effects. So can you predict which species should age more slowly in captivity? So we have a porcupine or a guinea pig. So looking at the environmental hazard factor, is it going to be low or is it going to be high? The porcupine has little risk of predation, and so it has a lower hazard factor. The guinea pig is going to have a high risk of predation, so it's going to reproduce soon, age quicker, and die younger. So it has a high hazard factor. So in turn, the porcupine is a longer life, the guinea pig will live shorter. So the rate of aging and pattern of mortality in a species is going to be determined by the hazard factor that that organism has in its environment. The environments characterized by low mortality risks are going to have populations of slowly aging individuals with long lifespans. In an environment characterized by a high mortality risk, the opposite is going to occur. So can we slow down that process of aging? Is life extension possible? Well, like we said, we talked about that with our fruit flies, and here shows a result of how they actually took it from the 20 hours. It went to 33 days, and then ended up with a 63-day lifespan. So by increasing the strength of natural selection later in life, it's going to be possible to increase the mean and maximum longevity of the individuals within a population. This occurs in nature and has also been done under controlled laboratory conditions. So human population is going to be growing very rapidly. Age pyramids are going to reveal much about a population. So what is the baby boom, and why is it bad news for young people today? Well, the baby boom happened half a century ago, yet young people today may end up paying the price for it. What exactly is it, and why does it still matter so much? Well, actually, the beginning of the late 1940s, just after World War II, and continuing through the early 1960s, families in the United States had many more babies. It was actually around 30% more children per month than they would have had if they had followed in the same pattern as their parents. Then the birth rates began to return to their earlier levels where they had remained ever since. So as the babies from the baby boom years grew up, schools had to increase their sizes to accommodate all of these children when they reached school age, and then the schools had to decrease in size once the baby boomers all graduated. So now, as these individuals approach retirement age, the question of how their retirement and healthcare needs will be met is going to be one of the biggest issues that face our society today. So describing populations in terms of proportions of individuals of each age group, that population age distribution is going to be how many people are going to be in each age group. So age groupings are going to be referred to as cohorts. So 0 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, 11 to 15, and so on, for example. Age pyramids are going to basically show the number of individuals in a population within any age group or within a cohort. So if two populations are the same size but have different age distributions, they will have some very different features. So here we're going to see that there's going to be two different shapes to these age pyramids. You have what's referred to as a rectangular shape, and then you have a triangular shape. Now with the rectangular shape, it's going to be the most common found in industrialized countries. So population is going to be growing slowly or not at all. Population is going to be mainly middle-aged or older, and birth and death rates are going to be low. If you look at the triangle, that's going to be most common in developing countries. And so population is going to tend to be much younger for the larger population, and birth and death rates are going to be higher. So here we're looking at the one we described with the baby boomers and retirement. So looking here at the age, we have females in blue, males in red. And so 85 plus, notice how they always say that females live longer, but if you look here, you'll see in this chart that it shows a dramatically larger population for females. It appears that it could almost be about 2.5, maybe even 3 times the size of the males at 85 plus. And that's going to be that upper end. Now looking at the boomers, which are going to be in the green section, you see how much larger those populations are than the younger populations, and of course the older populations, because they have a higher mortality rate. But still, those people who are going into retirement and those people who need health care are increasing, and then you're going to have the younger populations who are actually working and paying for these services are actually decreasing compared to those baby boomers. So age pyramids are going to show the number of individuals in a population within any age group, and they allow us to estimate birth and death rates over multi-year periods. So from third world to first world, the demographic transition. So the demographic transition is going to be a pattern of population growth that is experienced as a country industrializes. It's going to be characterized by slow growth, then fast growth, and then slow growth again. So with the slow growth, we see it characterized by high birth and death rates. It's going to be found in populations with insufficient systems of food production and distribution and lack of reliable medical care. With the fast growth, it's going to be characterized by high birth rates, low death rates. It's going to occur as industrialization begins. We're going to have food production and healthcare improving in these areas. And then you move to the slow growth. That's going to be characterized by low birth and death rates and occurs as industrialization occurs in these countries. So it has higher levels of education, employment, and improved healthcare. So exactly how high can it go? Well, with the current population, we have more than 7 billion, actually 8 billion people. And dependent on Earth's carrying capacity, they've estimated that it will carry around anywhere from 9 to 13 billion. So population growth is alarmingly slow in Sweden and alarmingly fast in Mexico. So what is the difference? The demographic transitions can take decades to complete, so it's not always easy to identify as it occurs. A survey of countries around the world, though, is going to reveal at different points on the transition. So in the past few decades, the demographic transition has been completed in Japan, Australia, and the United States, and Canada, and most of Europe. It's leading to a slowing of the population growth. But in Mexico, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and most of Africa, on the other hand, the transition has not been completed, and that population growth is going at a very dangerously fast rate. So the demographic transition tends to occur within the industrialization of countries. It is characterized by an initial reduction in the death rate, later followed by a reduction in the birth rate. So, human population growth, like we said, how high can it go exactly? Our current population right now is at around 8 billion. And so, like we said, it's going to be dependent upon Earth's carrying capacity. So looking here, we have current birth rates exceed death rates by so much that we add 80 million people to the world's population each year. And so estimations vary anywhere between this 8, 9 billion to 13 billion, with the median being around 11 billion. Two reasons of these estimations are going to vary, and they're going to be difficult to predict, but we can increase carrying capacity in 3 ways. We can expand into new habitats, we can increase agricultural productivity of land, and we can find ways to live in higher densities. So expanding into new habitats. With fire, tools, shelter, efficient food distribution, we can survive almost anywhere on Earth. Increasing agricultural productivity of land, well, with fertilizers and modern mechanized agricultural methods and selection for plants and animals with higher yields, fewer people can now produce much more food than was previously thought possible. And finding ways to live in higher densities. Public health and civil engineering advances make it possible for higher and higher densities of people to live together with minimal problems from infectious disease and waste management. So exactly how high can it go? Like we said, that's going to be very difficult to assess just how many resources each person is going to need. It's possible by estimating the ecological footprint of an individual in a population. That's basically evaluating how much land, how much food and water, and how much fuel, among other things, are going to be necessary. So resources are going to be that we use in the world as a whole is going to be significantly greater than resources available sometimes. So it's going to imply that we are already at Earth's carrying capacity if you look at what we're using today. So the world population is currently growing at a very high rate, but limited resources will eventually limit it, and likely at a population size between, well, we know it's past 7, but 8 to 11 billion. And that's going to end us for Unit 10.